Okay. Hello. All right. So, welcome to this session. We're going to talk about the role of social media in accessibility for language learning resources for lesser studied languages, which is a lovely mouthful of words, isn't it? So, just in case you don't know me, a very brief introduction. Hello, my name is Lindsay, and I am on a mission to teach as many people as possible how to learn a language. Although, if I'm sure that if you're here, then you know all about that stuff already. You know how you best learn languages. I've spent a while now doing this, 2 decades plus of my life learning languages, and have my BA and MA both in language related disciplines, both distance learning, both part-time. And most recently, of course, from those two was the MA in applied linguistics. And my dissertation topic is this lovely long title over here. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And my focus for that in terms of lesser studied languages was Guarani. So first of all, a few brief introductions, a few brief descriptions so that we're all on the same page before we get into this. So what is Guarani? Well, more specifically, I'm talking about Paraguayan Guarani. And Paraguayan Guarani, there's around 6.5 million speakers. So you can see from this nicely zoomed in, ever so slightly blurry map, that the bulk of the blue here, the bulk of the speakers are within Paraguay, but there are many Guarani varieties, both languages and dialects, that are spoken in the region as a whole. So it is an official language in Paraguay, official in Bolivia over here, we've got quite a little chunk, and in Corrientes province in Argentina in the north as well. And of course, then you can see it's spoken in little pockets in Brazil too. Why this focus on Guarani? Well, I visited Paraguay in 2018, and before I went, I knew that I was in Latin America for a while, and I knew I wanted to learn a new language. And Paraguay just happened to be towards the end of that route. And therefore I thought that's a good one because I have a little bit more time. So I opted to learn a bit of Guarani. And I did so before. I learned it during, I went to Guarani school there, and a little bit after as well. And what's really intrigued me with Guarani is how it's quite an unusual case study of both Indigenous and a colonial language living in a different way to how we typically expect, right? The usual story is colonial language comes in, Indigenous language gets a little bit crushed. And not to say that it's an easy ride for Guarani at all. That's not exactly how it has been, but it has now, it's in a very different position to a lot of languages in a similar situation. But why the focus in the piece on social media as well? Well, I was really interested in the duality of social media being a source for good and a source for bad. And there's always a new way to share because social media relies on us staying engaged. One of the ways that they want to keep us engaged is by providing new and interesting ways to share what it is that we want to share, right? Just think about how in the past handful of years, we've gone from Instagram being a very visual, photographically visual based platform, like still image, to then including video, to then including live stuff, and then including things like reels, very much based on TikTok, stories, very much inspired by Snapchat, and then just drawing from each other and adding these new ways to share all the time. So what that means is it's very current. And that means that in terms of language and as a language resource, it is one of the most up-to-date language resources that we actually have available in terms of modern current language use. And also, along the lines, before dissertation days of my MA, I did a module called Language and New Media, which was really, really interesting, focused on Guarani and social media in that module assignment. And I thought, yeah, this is kind of the route that I want to go down for the big dissertation at the end. So that's why there was this focus on social media. A few further descriptions before we get into the bulk of the session as well. So what do I mean when I say Indigenous language? Well, an Indigenous language is a language used within the territory from which it originates, typically by speakers native to that territory. Now, it is important not to confuse Indigenous language with endangered or minority. And this is because although there can be crossover, they do not describe the same features of a language. So not every Indigenous language is endangered, or a minority language as well. So there is crossover where a language could be Indigenous and minority and endangered, or 2 out of 3, but not always. And so it's important to recognize that these terms describe different features of language. As for endangered language is typically considered to be a language which has been identified as facing the threat of extinction. And of course, then we can have extinct languages at the end of that scale. And this occurs due to a language having a small number of speakers, which could be a result of so many different reasons. It could be things like war or genocide, colonialism, or other factors that have resulted in multilingual environments in which the endangered language has become lesser studied and lesser used. Because if we're not using a language, if we're not learning a language, then there's less need for it, there's less purpose for it, and it is likely to fall into endangerment. And just to describe minority language briefly, this is a language that is not the dominant language variety in a certain environment. Now, some speakers of minority languages prefer the term minoritized. I think I do too, to be honest. And this indicates as well, through this slight change in the word, that it's typically not a status that has been chosen by these speakers, but rather a status that's been imposed upon them through further use of other languages in a particular situation. Now, a language being a minority language or minoritized could therefore result in language endangerment or death in the future. And finally, in that title, we saw the term lesser studied language. And that's because I wasn't exactly focusing specifically on it being Indigenous or endangered or minority languages that was the focus. Really, what I was interested in is lesser studies. I just want to define a bit about what I mean by that. So in the US, the term less commonly taught languages is used by some organizations. In the EU, lesser used languages. So to me, they imply slightly different things, right? But lesser studied language is not quite as widely used. But I chose this myself for this work because it's like we're talking specifically about autonomous language learners, not necessarily people that are being taught explicitly, or people that are necessarily using these languages. We're talking about specifically lesser studied by autonomous learners. Therefore, that's a much more appropriate term in this instance. But of course, this poses the necessity for a bit of a nuance with each language if we're going to use this. So lesser studied languages may be, but are not always, lesser spoken, endangered, minority, or Indigenous. And this is the really key bit for that nuance between different languages. Languages may only be lesser studied in certain circumstances and or regions. So it's really worth remembering that too. What about then Paraguayan Guarani specifically? So we've seen our definitions. Where does that leave us with Paraguayan Guarani? This is an Indigenous language. This is a language that is native to the territory in which it's spoken. UNESCO, which has the list of language endangerment, states that Paraguayan Guarani is vulnerable. So it's not endangered and it's not at that end of the scale, but it is vulnerable, right? It's a minority language in some circumstances. So as we said, this is very much circumstantial, very much depends on how and where and, you know, the scenarios in which we're considering this. But in a global context, it is lesser studied. So within Paraguay, within, you know, Bolivia, Argentina, Brazil, in the regions specifically of those last 3 countries, it isn't necessarily going to be described as lesser studied. But in a global context, if we consider, you know, worldwide language learning, then yes, this is something that would be a lesser studied language. Okay, so existing research then before I started. In terms of social media and language learning, a lot of research is classroom-based. This is lots of fun when you're trying to put this together. A lot is classroom-based, and The increase in online language learning research really coincides with COVID-19, and is still based on previously classroom-based environments and how are the students coping now they've gone online, those sorts of things. So a lot is based on classroom where people are taught and not necessarily independent adult L2 learners. There's not enough research with that group of language learners, in my opinion. In terms of that asynchronous nature of social media, so social media, what I mean by asynchronous is that you can return to this. You don't have to be in the same time at the same place. There are certain elements, things like if someone is going live on Instagram, you would want to be there at that same time as they are live. But typically, unless they choose to delete it, you can watch it back after the fact as well. So there's this asynchronicity to social media that actually, we've got some research here from Perveen. We found that learners did recognize some key strengths of that, including that it's not time bound, it's not place bound, it allows time to reflect and allows for written responses from teachers. So compared to being in a classroom, there is an advantage to these elements of things like social media. Indigenous use of social media. So as you'll see in a minute, there's not a lot in terms of Guarani and social media. So I needed to broaden this slightly to consider other Indigenous languages and users of language in various contexts around the world. So of course, as with all of these things, we need that nuance to consider things in certain cases. But it was interesting nonetheless. Carlson and Kennedy, a lot of research by these two, Carlson in particular, in regards to Aboriginal Australians and use of the internet and modern technologies and things like that. They found that although social media gave Indigenous Australian users a tool through which to express their identity and communicate with other Indigenous people from across the world, it comes with the danger of subjecting yourself to racism and hate by identifying as Indigenous online. Oh, man. That's a lot, isn't it? And this is something, as we'll see later on, we as learners also need to be considerate of. It's important, therefore, that digital tools do not disrupt traditional customs, but give a resource through which Indigenous people can feel safe to create and share content for Indigenous people by Indigenous people. In a broader sense, some different studies, different scenarios around the world. Benitez, I believe this one is from Brazil, so quite close to Guarani. Indigenous use of social media can lead to support, such as protests happening on and offline. On the other hand, it can lead to online bullying and harassment. However, it should be noted that due to the flexibility of format, social media can be considered breathing spaces for Indigenous media. And of course, the majority of research in this area focuses on different Indigenous languages, and there really needs to be that allowance for nuance in every situation. In terms of Guarani and digital media, since around 2013, there have been many significant efforts to increase Guarani's presence online. So this includes a few different things. Firstly, a translation of 4 internet sites, so Facebook, Mozilla Firefox, Wikipedia. Often these are facilitated by the Secretaría de Políticas Lingüísticas of Paraguay, in English, the Ministry for Linguistic Politics. They do a lot of good work in terms of encouraging Guarani use and supporting the language on a national scale. Most recently, at the time of writing this, is the addition of Guarani to Google Translate. This happened in 2022, many years after I first started painstakingly learning the language without even Google Translate to fall back on. So I'm really glad that that's there now. It's a big advance in terms of the language and the presence, the online presence of the language too. There's also some attempts at things like parallel corpora, lexical databases, and lots of research into machine translation. And of course, all of this is really useful, not just for furthering, Guarani in digital spaces and increasing that presence, but also understanding more about Indigenous languages and digital spaces as a whole. But there is less research, as we've said, into the use of Guarani on social media specifically. And that's one reason why I wanted to research this a bit and talk about this, because I was so intrigued why there wasn't as much out there on that specific topic. In terms of education accessibility, it's important we talk about this too. As we said, that idea of lesser studied is different depending on context. Now, the Paraguayan constitution states that individuals are entitled to an education in their mother tongue if their mother tongue is Spanish or Guarani. If it's another language, they must choose between Spanish and Guarani. Now, in many schools, the language that is not the language of instruction, whether that be Spanish or Guarani, will be present and will be taught alongside other subjects as a subject. So much like in the UK, for example, where I live, we would learn French or Spanish or German in school alongside English as well. And it would be taught as the subject. Now, this isn't always the case. And although a minority, there are a number of monolingual Spanish and monolingual Guarani speakers in Paraguay too. In Argentina, it's taught in certain schools in Corrientes province, where it's an official language. In Bolivia, Spanish is the language of education, typically. Now, this actually, interestingly, does lead to a high dropout rate among rural populations, where, Bolivia does have not just Guarani, but many indigenous languages who, for whom Spanish isn't their first language. And so it's an old statistic now, hopefully is changing. But there are a small number of universities in Bolivia that do teach through indigenous languages, which is really cool, and teach really useful, locally useful and relevant topics, including Guarani. So Unibol Guarani is one of those. And finally, in those specific regions in Brazil, there are a small number of local schools that teach Guarani alongside Portuguese. Now, in addition to these more formal kind of academic education options, people often learn Guarani at home. They might use it casually with friends, frequently in spoken contexts and less so in written contexts. So what this means for the language is that it is much more fluid. And when it comes to being written, it either exists in this very pure form, or it exists in this very kind of, I'm going to guess how this is written. Does that looks about right? That looks how it should be, And so there is this interesting kind of two sort of ways of writing the language as well. Now, considering this, it may seem that the need to learn Guarani online and using things like social media typically isn't there for most regional and native learners. And yeah, that's fair. However, there is a growing demand from others in these countries. Remember, we said there are monolingual Spanish speakers in Paraguay who want to learn Guarani to better communicate with those who do speak it as a mother tongue in the region. So that's part of the demand for learning Guarani online. Another part, in regards to learners from other countries, there are learners who engage in missionary volunteer work in the region. And of course, there's also a growing number of language learning enthusiasts like me, like you, around the world, with increased access to a wider range of languages that we're curious about, that we want to learn about, including Guarani. And many teaching materials, this is also worth a mention in terms of accessibility, often involve some use of Spanish, if not completely taught via Spanish. So this could limit accessibility for learners who do not currently have a knowledge of Spanish. And as we'll see, this is one thing that the internet and social media can help with. Okay, so my research process, I conducted surveys and interviews. Initially, I was thinking this would be two kind of halves to this project, that there would be a survey for the creators of Guarani learning social media profiles, especially focusing on Instagram. And I thought as well, there'll be a survey for learners. However, I found that actually it was harder to connect, harder to find the learners. And so this angle was scrapped. That meant then that with the creators who completed the survey, I invited them to follow-up interviews, which were conducted with a smaller number of profile owners and teachers. So there was the initial survey and then the follow-up interviews focused on the creators. So it's worth mentioning that, I tried to kind of communicate directly with the learners, but we only really have the perspective of the creators in this research. In terms of findings, interaction. So one of the core things is that the results indicated that all educators, all the creators of the profiles, interacted directly with learners, which suggests their social media profiles provide a different learning environment for independent learners compared to a traditional one-directional independent resource. So think textbooks, similar resources like that we might traditionally use to learn a language on our own. Actually, what this implies is that we have a bit of back and forth. And remember, it's asynchronous. So we're not having to be there at the same time like we would with a class or with, an online lesson. This is something we can do more in our own time, which is pretty cool. However, what this does also mean is that educators who, perhaps choose to share this content in order to increase the presence of the language online and to teach others unidirectionally do run the risk of becoming a resource in themselves, in addition to the profile content. So we need to be mindful as learners that we're not, overstepping the mark and treating the profile creator, the person behind the profile, as much of a resource as we are the content that they choose to share as well. This can be quite demanding. Learners don't always appreciate this, the time and effort that it takes to individually respond to every message. And one survey participant admitted that he stopped replying after 2 or 3 messages typically. So if people might reach out, he might say, this is, they've asked a question, this is the answer. They'll ask another question. He's like, okay. And then another one, he kind of has to stop. And you can see why, because otherwise owners run the risk of becoming kind of burnt out, perhaps not thinking then, I'm just not going to bother creating any new profile content. I'm just going to avoid the time-consuming individual messages from learners from the get-go, just cut them off at the source, So there is that risk as well. Public versus private language choice. So there's a few implications that I found from this. So all participants that I asked, excluding one, stated that they use social media in their daily and personal lives. Now, a common thread that came through from answers to this question was that the content they share on public profiles, so something like Facebook, generally is in Spanish. And in those private spaces, so think WhatsApp, it's in Guarani. Now, the use of Guarani more frequently on WhatsApp than on public social media like Facebook does really imply that there is a difference in use between public and private platforms. Now, this poses a few interesting different questions. Firstly, it implies that Guarani used on a public platform is more closely monitored than the use of Guarani on WhatsApp. The fact that people are choosing to use Guarani in those private spaces, there's less monitoring needed. They feel more comfortable to use the language. Whereas sharing publicly, it feels like you've got to monitor yourself a little bit more. Participants did express feeling more connected with family and friends via those WhatsApp groups when they were using Guarani, right? Now, as one participant mentioned, when using Guarani publicly online, you are aware of the audience exclusion that you are creating. You know when you're choosing a language to share, if you're multilingual and you're choosing to share something in one language, you are aware of the exclusion that you're creating. Despite this, when users do still posting Guarani on their public profiles, be this their personal accounts or the accounts that we're talking about in this research, there is likely to be more monitoring that takes place, perhaps unconsciously. We don't necessarily even realize we're doing this, but if we know that something is going to be public, we do tend to think more about how we share and what we share, Now, what this means for learners, this is the other side of this, is that the Guarani that they then see on profiles teaching and sharing Guarani is likely to be closer to pure Guarani, Guarani puro, as it's called. Now, this could lead them to sounding very formal when attempting to speak with native speakers, because what's interesting, I mentioned earlier how it's not always a written, it's mostly a spoken language. There are, of course, written things, but in daily life, it's spoken a lot more. And that variety that tends to be spoken is something called jopara. Jopara is a mixture of Spanish and Guarani. It's a variable mixture. So the easiest definition here is, this was one of my other assignments, the easiest definition here is language variety, right? Or you could call it a sociolect, something like that. It's not specifically a dialect. It's not really a language. We'll call it sociolect. We'll call it variety, because that covers us in terms of definition. But this jopara has this mixing of Spanish and Guarani to different levels with different speakers. And so it's not as easy to write that down as it is to write down the pure Guarani, the Guarani puro, which in terms of, as a learner, if you're learning primarily through written sources, you could end up sounding quite formal when you're not including those bits of Spanish like native speakers do when they're using jopara, right? So it's possible that this is not a problem. You know, it would be perhaps a comparison as if you learn MSA for Arabic and then you go to Egypt and everyone is speaking to you in Egyptian Arabic and you speak and you sound quite formal, right? That might be a good comparison here. But it's also likely then that when you're in those encounters and you're having real conversations, that conversation could revert to Spanish, because native speakers maybe detect that level of over formality in your spoken Guarani. And typically, Guarani is used as a language of close connection in situations where Spanish often plays a more formal and official role. So this public and private use of Spanish versus Guarani and the different profiles by the creators really has the potential to have this impact on what they choose to share on their public, Guarani education profiles, and then how we as learners interpret that and access that, because it's obviously it's obviously more difficult for learners to then penetrate these private spaces in order to access a more realistic use of Guarani. Now, this is justified. I am not for a second arguing that speakers should just let the learners into their private conversations. No, absolutely not. All people online should be allowed access to private spaces where they can connect and communicate in their language of choice, especially speakers of Indigenous languages who are so frequently subjected to more consequences than others when using their language publicly online. Think back to lots of that research from Carlson that I mentioned with the Australian stuff. Now, for learners, that issue therefore becomes finding and accepting that line of privacy that they should respectfully acknowledge. It's not about trying to infiltrate those private spaces, to join those WhatsApp groups. It's about actually just, finding that line of privacy that feels acceptable. Learning seriousness. So this was another big finding across the board with the people I spoke with. Now, in regards to how seriously the followers of these accounts and students are learning Guarani, there was a general consensus that the amount of serious learners is very low. One participant said that for many, it's a case of like, scroll when they encounter the content that he shared, right? Now, it's interesting to wonder, is this just because it's social media and it's how we've grown to use social media, or is there a way that we can use this more? Because it's also worth noting that another participant did claim a much higher 50% of her followers learning seriously. And of course, these are all presumed numbers from these people. This isn't an exact figure they've gone through and asked all their followers. But this is just their assumption, around 50% learning seriously. Now, this could be influenced by the fact that this person actually teaches Guarani, not just shares on social media, but also is a growing teacher, and therefore is more likely to be followed by active learners rather than those with a passing interest and curiosity. Perhaps these learners have found that the content helps them learn vocabulary and grammar, or provides them with improved motivation, which correlates as well with some more things that I found earlier on in the work. And of course, like I say, these are just the perceptions of people and not the learners themselves. And even with the learner survey and possible follow-up interviews, if that had worked out, there still would have been a skew, but it might have been in the other direction, right? Because learners who care enough to voluntarily participate in a survey would potentially be more invested in learning the language anyway, right? I'm not necessarily going to attract the non-serious learners to spend their time filling out a survey about a language they're not seriously learning. Do you see what I mean? So we may still never have quite found the answer there. So with this in mind, what does this mean? How can numbers of serious learners using social media be increased, if at all? Well, firstly, whose responsibility is this? Is it the creators? No. Really, no. It's a heavy burden that they didn't ask for this, to be responsible for the seriousness of learners. They are, in most cases, sharing content with no financial payment. Their only responsibility is to ensure that the language they share is an accurate representation of current usage. And a friendly reminder here, all varieties of a language are valid, right? Like, I'm not here for grammar police. Not all creators are teachers by trade as well, it's worth noting. And so they shouldn't automatically be expected to explicitly teach the language and teach you how to learn the language, because that's not necessarily their role or their strength or their job, right? So what about you, us as learners? Well, as we've said, if it's not the responsibility of creators that free consumers are serious learners, then kind of falls with us as learners. If we want to be serious learners, then we can take this further ourselves. Now, this isn't going to be as true for people attending this event, of course, but often people don't take responsibility for their learning, for their progress. We let a teacher teach and hope that it kind of washes over, right? Some people think, okay, I booked the lesson, I'm just going to show up, it's going to be there. I've bought the book. Oh, oops, it's spent 3 months gathering dust on the shelf, right? This is a really common thing that happens with whole other aspects of life, not just language learning. But in language learning, it's quite common. But actually, I believe anything can be used as a language learning resource with a creative angle on that. And social media is just that. It's a tool, and its usefulness as a language resource is all about how we use it. So if we are choosing to take responsibility for our learning, for our progress, then we can choose to take responsibility about how we use the tools available to us. And if we want that most modern and current example of language, then social media is a great tool that we can make use of. So how do we do this? Well, if we're thinking, if you're in this like, yeah, why aren't there more serious learners using social media? It's a case of leading by example, right? People won't just suddenly start to use social media out of the blue as a more serious learning tool individually. It's kind of a ripple effect of leading by example. And if this is something that you want to do, we're all capable of changing the way that we use this in our language learning. And this can easily then impact the interpretations that others have too. Ripple, 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 right? So firstly, think about expanding our definition. Now, we think of social media as Instagram, Facebook. I was going to say Twitter, but maybe I should say X. These kinds of platforms, right? And my dissertation did too. This was the focus when I used the term social media. These were the platforms in particular that I was focusing on. But really, it can be expanded to include a whole range of platforms that we might not have considered. There's a few different categorizations of this. I really like this one from Chisenga et al. 15 categories. So are you ready? And there may be some here that you don't agree with at all. But if we're being open-minded here, we're ready to expand our definition. So firstly, sites like Facebook, this would be social networking, right? So rather than calling them social media, we're calling them a social network, kind of like the film. things that are voice over internet, such as Skype. This is a social media, a media that has the potential to be social. If we flip it around, it suddenly becomes like, oh yeah, it is a media that has the potential to be social, right? Discussion forums, so things like Reddit, microblogging, such as Twitter, cloud storage, such as Dropbox, online mapping, like this one, and cloud storage as well, actually really got me like, yeah, you can comment, right? Online mapping, such as Google Maps, online collaborative applications, such as Wikipedia, video sharing, such as YouTube, presentations, such as Google Slides, photo sharing, such as Flickr, calendars, Google Calendar, blogging, such as WordPress, social bookmarking, such as Pinterest, academic social networking, such as ResearchGate, and audio sharing, such as SoundCloud. So a lot, a lot of different things. And like I say, you might not use or agree with all of these, but really it's worth expanding as far as we can to begin with before we decide to, if we want to sort of narrow things down again to the things that we see as most useful. Eliminate the stigma. So social media has a bad reputation for being a time suck, being very vapid, being full of people spouting their opposite opinions, right? But as we've seen, when we expand our definition, it can become something much more than that, right? You don't get people being vapid or spouting their opposing opinions on Google Maps. Actually, no, you can leave reviews. That was a bad example. Dropbox, there we go. So it can be a lot more than that. And even platforms that we typically consider to have earned their bad reputation can be beneficial, because mostly, with the exception of AI kind of creeping in a little bit more and more and more each day, mostly it's people that create content that exists on social media. So when we find useful content on social media for language learning, we shouldn't dismiss it simply because of its origin, right? We can take it, we can extract it, and we can consider how this can be something useful to help us learn. Respectful of spaces. So as we saw from the study, when specifically considering Indigenous languages, social media can be considered breathing spaces for Indigenous media. And this means that as learners, we need to be respectful of users choosing to share their language and really mindful of what we choose to share ourselves in this regard. So it's not always about sharing recordings of your practice like it might be with a commonly learned language, because there are certain cases where people choose to not vocalize, their language like we've seen. It could be putting them at risk of judgment and things like this. And so as a learner, to just come in and be like, oh, I'm going to use this language and talk about it all the time and share videos of me talking in it, could be slightly disrespectful. So it's worth being considerate of the language and not extracting a language from its culture and from its existing speakers, so that we can recognize when we learn a language, we're understanding. What we're really doing is understanding more about others that we share the planet with. And so, yeah, just being a bit respectful of that is definitely key. So there really needs to be some observance of speakers' own use of the language on platforms, rather than just coming in, sharing it to yourself, thinking, okay, how are other people using this? How am I seeing this language? And with lesser studied languages and social media, much like with language learning in general, consumption typically comes before publicly shared production of the language. Now, I don't say this to keep lesser studied languages less public, but rather just to note the differences that as learners we need to pay attention to when we are learning different languages. Change our use. So typically we might consider, yeah, I use social media for language learning, but it's this kind of passive, extra fun bit on the side. It's not like the core resource that we're going to use. It's just something that you do, and you've followed the right account so that it adjusts your algorithm to show you some language learning content. Well, when we instead bring it more into our learning rather than leave it on the sidelines, it can become a more useful tool. So we can go beyond scrolling, right? I'm just going to give 3 very simple, very broad ideas. Using captions as texts to dissect, using visual content as texts to transcribe, and using content as speaking and writing prompts. So essentially, what we're doing in terms of changing our use is we are expanding beyond the initial existence and purpose of that post, right? So yeah, loads more, a lot of suggestions that we could dig into, but these 3 quite sort of broadly cover a lot of the uses that you'll be thinking about. And finally, understanding how we learn. So learning more about how we, and you specifically, learn languages to know how to best take things further in ways that will be most beneficial for you. So not always to use social media more seriously for learning are going to suit you. It's really about seeing which current methods working for you could perhaps be adapted to include social media content. So if you, for example, once a week read an online newspaper article, maybe instead of that, you actually find the Instagram post that publication shared the article via, right? Or you find the Facebook post that they shared the link via, and you read that and you see the comments, and you take it from a different angle slightly. And of course, because it's all asynchronous, you can revisit as much as you need, which is really, really helpful when we are learning independently. Okay, thank you very much. If you have any questions, you are more than welcome to contact me. My email is lindsay@doeslanguages.com. My website is lindsaydoeslanguages.com. And yeah, I will see you very soon. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much. Bye.